How's everybody this afternoon?
Excellent.
All right, that's what I like to hear. Well, I'm very glad that you are able to make it to our Info Barbecue this afternoon. Our guest speaker, our featured speaker, Mr. David Haynes, was unable to join us today, but we do have a very worthy substitute, Mr. John Orr, who's going to be speaking to you this afternoon. Just to give you a little background on Mr. Orr, he is the manager of the Atlanta Regional Commission's Transportation Access and Mobility Division, and he manages Atlanta MPO. He leads and coordinates the efforts of 20 transportation planners as part of ARC Center for Livable Communities. ARC is the Metropolitan Planning Organization leading transportation planning for the 20-county Atlanta region. John is a graduate of the University of Tennessee, a volunteer. We have some other volunteers out there? Oh, well.
Wrong state.
That's okay. He has an MS degree in planning. He graduated from the University of Virginia, College of Wise, with a BA degree in planning and business and public administration, excuse me. He previously worked for the Atlanta Daughtry Planning Commission and the Athens County Planning Department. He is a member of the American Planning Association. He received his professional planning designation from the American Institute of Certified Planners. And John is also a member of the Transportation Research Board's statewide multimodal transportation planning committee. So, without further ado, Mr. John Orr.
Thank you.
All right, no problem.
Well, it's very exciting to be with you today. Over in Atlanta, we also have a similar leadership program for high school students that we call the Model Atlanta Regional Commission. My son actually went through that this last year. He's going to be a senior this summer for next year. So I hope you all are getting a lot out of it and learning a few things as well. I'm just going to share a little bit of information with you about some of the planning work we do in Atlanta, and tell you a little bit about the Atlanta region, and hopefully you'll be able to take some things away from this. Ultimately, you'll be able to, we hope that you'll be able to gain an interest in this field of planning, which is very exciting, very rewarding, very fun. And as we're going through this, we definitely need to get you all out. I think it's at least 5 before 1. But if you do have questions as I'm going through the material, just go ahead and raise your hand, and we'll try to tackle them as we go through it if that works for you. Well, first of all, we were required by the federal government, and even if we weren't required to do it, we have to do long-range plans, just like Tampa does. All the big regions in the country, we have to look at least 20 years out in the future and identify what's the right thing for our community to do as it relates to projects, plans, and such. And when you think ahead in 20 years, actually you all will be the ones that will be running things. And so it's exciting to get the younger folks involved with the overall planning process. But an important point is that Metro Atlanta, we're about a region of 20 counties, about 100 cities, about 5.5 million people, and we're expecting that we're going to grow a lot. Our region's just like Tampa, the Tampa region, in a lot of ways, we're expecting a lot of growth to where it's going to be over 8 million people by the year 2040. And along with a lot of growth, it comes some challenges too. It brings opportunities because that means there's going to be more jobs, but also managing that growth is important. How do you protect the natural environment? How do you ensure that a broad section of the community can benefit from the growth as well? And it's like, but you've got to always be thinking ahead, and I think this is a pretty clever saying by Will Rogers up here, is that you've got to constantly be adjusting how you're planning for the future because the world's changing very, very quickly. Well, what we do is that within our region, we have a policy board of 37 elected officials and people from the federal government, and they really set the policy guidance for our region from all the 20 counties in the state of Georgia as well. And this graphic illustrates ultimately what the vision is that we're working towards. And it's not just a transportation focus, because it truly is cross-cutting. Without a good economy, you won't have the revenues to really be able to have a good transportation system. Also, people won't, if they don't have good jobs, they won't have a good quality of life. And also, unless you have healthy, livable communities, you won't have a very good economy. So all this is related. So what we try to do is really focus our plan in that middle part there, which is the Venn diagram, which is winning the future. And it takes all those various factors to lead to success. So this is the entire focus, or the primary focus for our organization, including above and beyond transportation planning, land use planning, and economic development, and natural resources planning. And so as we do try to develop and craft plans on how to win the future, there is no single path. There's a lot of uncertainties that we all deal with, and you will deal with too as you get older and get in your chosen professions as well. And so ultimately what we want to do as part of our overall regional planning process is address uncertainty. And uncertainty is the biggest factor we face in what we do. There's just so many unknowns now. And your generation, as you start to take a lot of our places in the workplace, you're going to see that pace of change even increase for some reasons I'm going to share with you in a moment. Now, the first step in developing plans historically, and this is the way that all the big regional planning agencies around the country have done planning for decades, is this graphic here. And it's called the normative scenario development process. And what that really, when you break it down, is that you'll see the graphic on the left. We understand where people live now, what the transportation system is, where the roads are, where there's transit. And then we forecast that the way that we want it to be or think it's going to be in the future. Typically, it's at least 20 years in the future. And we'll look at the future using what we call travel demand models and land use models. And we'll develop transportation projects to address the needs. Like if a lot of people move to a community and they need to get to downtown, we'll look at both improving the roads and also building transit to connect them as well. And that's the way things have been done for a long time. But the big issue with it is that based on the history around the country, none of that really works out according to plan. People don't move exactly where you think they're going to move, nor do they travel the way you thought they were going to travel. So a lot of places around the country are moving towards another way to do long-range planning and look at different scenarios, and it's called exploratory planning. And what this is much more flexible and allows you to look at, based on the uncertainty under different scenarios, like identify what the common factors are that really a community needs to address. Now, one of the reasons this is very important, and I know this graphic takes a moment or two to soak in, is that the pace of change and how rapidly the world's changing, and especially the implementation of technology, is just incredible. And in fact, I think many of you, if you're like a junior or a senior in high school, this is just normal to you. But for folks that may be in their 40s or 50s that have seen this happen, the pace of change is just staggering. What this graphic illustrates was like over history, how long it takes when new disruptive technologies are implemented before a quarter of the population has really adopted them. And you can see it's hard to believe that the radio was invented in 1897. It took 31 years before 1/4 of the population had a radio. Personal computer was really released commercially back in 1975, and it took 16 years, hard to believe, till 1991 before 1/4 of the population really had access to a personal computer. And honestly, that was my last year of graduate school. So I was one of those poor people, so I was cool, I was a trendsetter. But the thing that has just been the most remarkable is really been the smartphone and the cell phone, which is changing really the entire economy. Is that the Apple iPhone was really released around 2008, 2009. Before that time, there was very few people that had a smart mobile device. And is there anyone in the room that may not have it? Well, I don't want you to point you out, but I would imagine everyone here has a smartphone or close to it. And this pace of technological change is just going to continue and speed up. And so it makes it very difficult for us as planners to say what's next and really look at what we should do. There's what we have to look at first and foremost are what we call the drivers of change. And these drivers of change are what we as planners want to understand and really develop plans around. And really, you may not have heard this acronym before, but it's called STEEP. Most of these drivers of change fall in this category: social, technology, economic, environmental, and political. And these are really very important to understand, because even though I work in the transportation field, there's social changes that impact what I'm doing as much as anything else. We'll get into a couple of those in a moment as well. But ultimately, at our organization, we went through a process where we spoke to national experts. We had a stakeholder survey. We spoke to our region's elected officials, and we asked them about what do they think are the primary drivers of change. And ultimately, we identified 9 of these. And these are them. And the biggest one is certainly the first one that we're wrestling with right now. And this is the concept of autonomous vehicles. Has anyone heard of autonomous vehicles yet? Wow, it's a dumb question, wasn't it? But it looks like most of you have. 3 years ago, no one talked about autonomous vehicles. It was sort of a fantasy, could happen, may not happen. But now, by the end of the year, there's going to be Tesla, thinks by the end of 2018, actually, they will have a fully autonomous vehicle. And in fact, this is going to be probably the biggest disruptor we'll see in the transportation arena, because there's some experts think that a child born today may never drive a car, that they may have access to an autonomous vehicle their whole life. And you can imagine what that would mean in the future. So it's going to be a huge disruptor. The aging of the population is, and I won't go through each and every one of these, but this is a big issue in our part of the country in Atlanta. And what it means for transportation is that as you age, it's harder to drive, much harder to drive. You can't turn your head very well to look back out. And if we had autonomous vehicle technology, it would help a whole lot. People could live in their homes longer, because the biggest reason people end up moving from their homes is because they can't drive. And you may have had grandparents that unfortunately not able to drive and see how that impacts their lives. So a lot of this technology is going to have a major impact on all of us, including in our region and yours as well. But ultimately, how do all these drivers fit together? Is that the main thing that we want to look at is we want to make sure scenarios and these drivers that change are plausible and reasonable. And we have a big staff, we have a big region in Atlanta, and we often have to reel people in because they'll get so much into the fantasy like, well, if this were to happen, it would solve everything, but it's not realistic. So that's the first thing we want to do, is make sure that these are plausible relationships between these various drivers of change. And one item that maybe just to show you how all this relates is on this subject of autonomous vehicles, is that if they do become commercially available pretty soon and available, what would that mean? And this is where the planning gets to be pretty complex. And back to this point here, will older folks, will they embrace the technology because they can live longer and independently in their homes, or will they be not comfortable using the technology? Depending, and ultimately that's sort of a human nature issue in question. Because if they were to embrace autonomous vehicles technology, it would totally change the way that we do planning and what we previously thought for decades in our profession in transportation. But if they're sort of intimidated by the technology, it could certainly take away some of the potential benefits. Now, also, to show you how these relationships between these drivers have changed, is that ultimately, if someone can get access to an autonomous vehicle, do they even need to own their own car? I don't know if any of you used Uber or Lyft before, I'm sure some of you have, is that you just put in where you're at, put in your credit card, and you've got a ride wherever you need to go. And what happens if someone, a community or household didn't need to own a car? How much additional funds they would have. It's not unusual to spend $1,000 a month for a car just on the car payment and the insurance. So that would be tremendous. But also, it's got other impacts associated with it too. Will it cause more traffic congestion? So there's a lot of relationship there. And then one of the other big items that we're looking at right now is going to be ultimately how would this really, the emergence of autonomous vehicles impact transit systems. This is one of the biggest debates in our planning profession right now, is that would less people use transit if the autonomous vehicle technology was available? And one of the foundations of regional planning all over the country in big areas that have a lot of congestion and are pretty big is ultimately to expand transit. So there's a huge debate going on around the country. What would be the impact of this? Personally, I think it's going to be beneficial both to the transit systems and the users of it. But there's people concerned that folks wouldn't use transit, they would just call someone or get an autonomous vehicle. So our board and worked very hard, and our elected officials, and we worked with the citizens, and ultimately we led to 4 scenarios, of which I'm going to try again in a moment to show you our gaming tool, but I may not be able to get access to it. You would really like that, but we'll try again here in a moment. We developed these 4 scenarios, and let me just quickly walk you through these. And like I said, if you've got any questions as we're going through it, feel free to ask, because I think we're going to be pretty good on time. First one is what we called a full steam ahead scenario, which basically assumed that the future was going to be very similar to the way it is now. That yes, we were going to see a lot of emerging trends happen, like the autonomous vehicles, population get older, increasing environmental regulations, but communities would adjust to it pretty well. Then another scenario is what we called our technology reigns scenario, and that would be the one where the automation of the economy would take increase in frequency and speed up. And just to give you an example about, it's not just the technology impacting like autonomous vehicles and smartphones as such, but it's got the potential to very much impact you by the time you enter the workforce. Now, ultimately, robots are really displacing jobs in a lot of manufacturing and warehousing all around the country. And to give you an example, we just, in Atlanta, there was like a 1 million square foot warehouse facility that's just announced that it was going to open, and it's going to have 67 jobs in a 1 million square foot building. And a 1 million square foot building, in that context, that's like a mall. But it's got 67 jobs in it. And basically it's people taking care of the robots that's getting the goods. And so that's going to have huge impacts on our economy, moving forward. So that was one of the items we looked at. And then fierce headwinds. That scenario was one where we wanted to understand what would be the potential if the economy did not adjust to a lot of these changes. And honestly, one of them was associated with climate change and the potential for droughts. And so we looked at that as well. And that was the one that was the hardest to develop because we have a policy committee of elected officials. They don't always agree on a lot of the big trends and such. And then the final one was green growth, which was really associated with assuming that we would drastically cut greenhouse gas emissions, that people would use transit more, and maybe give you a few more details on that in a moment. But ultimately, we developed narratives around all 4 of these scenarios. And this is on the screens, just an example for the full steam ahead scenario. And you, of course, can't read every word on this, but ultimately, this was the scenario that most of our region's elected officials in the community liked the best, because it showed the community could adjust to some of the technology changes, embrace them, more autonomous vehicles, more transit, plus other types of projects. And this seemed to be the one that certainly had the most support. But when you really look into the future about what's going to happen, is that ultimately we as planners, we want to know and we do our best to know, but with the uncertainty that's here and you're going to be living with in your life and the pace of change, we don't really, no one has all the answers. So that's part of what the benefits of this kind of scenario planning is that it gives you the flexibility to really work around these uncertainties. This is the percentages here were the preferences about, and the feedback we got that you can see among those 4 scenarios, and nearly half the people were thought that the full steam ahead scenario was going to be the right one, or the one most likely. With the one with the fewest amount of people agreed with were more of the, I guess you could call it an Armageddon scenario with only that fierce headwinds. Now the very interesting thing that we did develop, and I wanted to walk through this with you because it would really help put everything together, was going to be our online scenario development tool. I'm going to try this one more time and just see if it'll work. If it doesn't, we'll give up on it. But just be patient with me in a moment. While I'm up here trying to make up time, or are you all enjoying this so far?
Yeah.
Oh, good. What's been the most fun thing you've been able to do? This presentation?
Good answer.
Oh, it looks like we're not going to be able to get outside of the firewall. Oh, well, I'm sorry about that. But we tried.
If we have the address, we'll do it in our rooms with the kids tomorrow, because we have
Okay.
full Wi-Fi access there. Okay?
I'll get that to you.
All right. Yeah, just email it to me and Beth, and we will show them tomorrow.
Very good. So where do we go now? It is ultimately just like the Tampa region does in Atlanta. We have to give recommendations to the elected officials in our community, including state and federal staff and elected officials as well, about, based on the future and some of these drivers of change, what would we recommend they do? And this graphic illustrates what I think most communities do. And when you all are future policymakers, you'll have to kind of go through a similar thinking process. Is that, first of all, let's say there's a driver of change that has got the potential to be not positive, to not be good. Is that, so we as a staff have to give them policy recommendations, options, that they then can make what's called policy interventions. How could they change the trend? Also, if it's a trend that is going in a policy direction, a positive direction, we want to keep going in that direction. And so the way that you do that typically is going to be through policy support and incentives. You know, like for instance, in our region, in Metro Atlanta, which we have some very bad traffic in Metro Atlanta. I don't know if any of you have ever been there, but it's just a lot of traffic. So we want to encourage people to use transit, so we give incentives to get people to use transit. Like we'll say if you normally drive to work by yourself and you want to take transit, our region will give somebody like $50 a month over around 3 months to encourage them to do that. So that's an example of how we use the scenario planning to help set policies. And then in closing things out, and this is an important point as well, is that ultimately we want to manage in the future looking at the likelihood and potential direction and even the magnitude of impacts of policies. And as you can see, that dealing with uncertainty is the key factor there. And then understanding the negative versus positive impacts is that ultimately we want to work in that range to develop policies, and these policies can be all over the place. They can be related to economic development, aging, and transportation, of course, as well. These are just some policy actions we're speaking to our elected officials in Atlanta about based on the scenario planning work we did. Is that first one, and I won't go through each and every one of these with you, is we want to encourage the use of technology in transportation projects. It can help us get more cars through a roadway with, if we have traffic signals that know if there's a car on the side street or not. And so we're assessing, like, do we give more points when we evaluate projects to those types of projects? because just like Tampa, our MPO, we have some money that we can allocate to local governments as well. And then one thing that we're worried about, or our elected officials are, is really that third bullet. And it's an important one, is that I don't know as much about the Tampa region as in Atlanta, but like in Atlanta, we have areas that are really struggling communities. They're struggling, like the community is, they have high unemployment rates, poverty, and so we want to have some of these emerging technologies and these trends to help benefit them. And one of the things we're discussing with their community about is like trying to get Uber and Lyft and other rideshare companies to help give lower fees to these communities. And it's a huge issue because ultimately, like in our region, we want the whole region to do well. We don't want areas that are struggling to be left out because it creates a lot of tension. So that's a huge policy discussion in Atlanta right now. But, and I do believe this is the last slide, is these are the questions we're working with right now with our elected officials in the state of Georgia in Atlanta, is ultimately local communities have a very difficult job. And I'll give you another example of a disruptor. Is how many of you, and I don't know if you have necessarily, live in a community that's got a big mall in it right now? About everyone it looks like. But well, these malls over the long term are under a lot of threats because of what we call online retailing. And that's going to be like Amazon and such. Amazon can just, they can deliver products and price it cheaper than you can get at a mall in most cases now. And so we're very worried in Atlanta over the long run, what are we going to do with our malls? Because it's a big threat. But why local governments care is that these are one of the biggest, if not the biggest, source of taxes in an entire community. Local governments in the state, they collect sales taxes off of a mall. Also, they get property taxes. And if they're not there, it's got the potential to really adversely impact our communities because like the sales taxes paid is from everything from schools to roads to transit. So that's one of the big issues we're dealing with as well. So that's one of the things we've heard from them. And in response to some of these questions about you need to go back and look at this. So I really wish we could get the gaming tool working for you. And like I said, we'll see if maybe that can get up tomorrow. It's an interesting exercise I think I'd love to hear what you all think about the future and what's likely and not likely. But it was a pleasure speaking with you, and I guess if we got a time, we could take a question or two. Would that be okay? If you all have any.
You have a few minutes, so if anyone has questions, and we'll put the gaming tool on in the morning when you guys come in, if you're here for the flip program.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm not a flip student, but I do have a question. Actually, it's kind of a two-part question. So what kind of policy, I guess, interventions are you recommending for both the gray fields, the sort of dying classic suburban shopping mall, and then also the jobs that will
turn that down at least.
Hope that wasn't
we
me.
usually have that impact. The jobs.
Next question.
The jobs that will be replaced by the new technologies, specifically I'm thinking of autonomous vehicles, which with a huge percentage of folks who work in the transportation industry, I was wondering what kind of, how you all plan on addressing that.
No, that's a good question. I can't tell you we've got all the answers yet, but on the first item, we've seen in Metro Atlanta some major retailers that have went bankrupt this year, something like H.H. Gregg. Sears is struggling right now. And so ultimately, what the big debate or discussion is right now, is there something following them that could fill that space in the retail arena? And the short answer, it does not look like there is because of the online retailing. So we've been working with local governments to better understand how open they are to potentially putting in what we as planners would call mixed-use developments, mixing housing along with the retail and such. And there's mixed feelings about that. But I think that that will definitely be a major issue. The other question you have related to automation and the impact of that and what's next is there's a huge issue that I think some of we're aware of, maybe aware of, is that the baby boomers are getting ready to retire. And what's the generations following the baby boomers, even like the millennial generation is on paper even bigger than the baby boom generation is. It's just that there's not going to be enough people to replace those that are retiring unless there's a lot of migration outside the country. And so we are probably going to have to get a lot of people moving in that are able to, like fast-growing regions like Tampa and Atlanta, we're better able to kind of keep our workforces stable, but smaller communities are really struggling with that. And so the automation is probably going to happen and would have some helpful benefits just because the retirees are going to outnumber the new people coming into the workforce. But ultimately, we don't want it to get so out of hand that the issue would be, bottom line on it, is that there's people that can work and want to work, can't get jobs. And we're very worried about that with especially some of the entry-level positions. But it's a good question. We're really wrestling with that. Well, any other questions? So where are you guys going to next today? All right. We've got a good football team now, or have had one. Well, it's a pleasure. I hope you enjoy this experience, and thank you very much.
Thank you.